Guys, what's going on? Red Match here, and welcome back to another edition of Cards and Castles Meta Monthly, where today we are going to be going over the top 3 meta decks for the months of August and September of 2018. Now, I know this time last month I said that I was holding off on the July-August Meta Monthly, but I ended up not really pushing that out there due to the fact that the changes that we've got around this time last month have really shaken things up. So I was gonna let that kind of sit for a moment and really just digest everything that the update brought to us. But by that point, as I was sitting there and I was expecting to make this or make that kind of meta monthly for July and August around maybe the 20th. But as that time got closer, I thought to myself it might just be a better idea to hold off until this time next month, so that way I can really do a proper meta monthly and help digest things that have really occurred, or the reason why this update has shaken the meta decks, and the reason why the meta decks featured on today's video are in a place that they are at, whether that's due to the update or not, and I'm going to kind of, again, digest that for you. So, with that being said, without wasting further time, let's go ahead and get into deck number 1 for this edition of Meta Monthly. So the first deck we are going to be talking about today is school decks. Now, the school decks, of course, are no stranger to the Meta Monthly. Of course, sometimes being at the number 1 slot, and sometimes, of course, dropping off and then them ending up re-emerging. And that scenario is true for what they are kind of in now, or at least the state that they're in now kind of fits that. The school decks haven't really dropped off of power, and they're still extremely dangerous decks for people to play against. The reason being, of course, school can get out of hand real fast, and your opponent, or whoever is using the school deck, I probably should say, can have opportunities to draw multiple cards into their hand, continuing to pile on resources as long as they have some sort of treasure going on, whether that be from cards like Southport Captain, Dread Pirate, or simple things like Merchant's Favor or Mugging. And of course, the combination of factions, typically green-yellow for school decks, don't really have anything to really laugh at either in terms of those resources. Cards like Kraxus from Crusaders, Krakens from Pirates. I've seen Krakens kind of integrated more a little bit in there. And then your kind of neutral things, Minotaur, Flux, Barbarian. So there are a lot of factors that do make the school decks dangerous, but the reason why they haven't really fallen off of the sort of meta monthly, and this is going to kind of be true for a later deck we discussed too, Pirates really didn't get hit by the update too much. Now, the only things that were remotely hit in terms of pirate cards, I think in terms of nerfs anyway, were the Witch Doctor, who did get a attack decrease to about 4 rather than 5, and the Salahar Voyager did get nerfed in terms of stats. But those two changes alone don't really justify, worthy changes for this to stop running the school deck. The Voyager is still extremely useful in delivering a monster package into any deck. Obviously, her effect of decreasing a monster card in your hand by 6 gold on the turn means that you can easily see a turn 4 Minotaur still being operated in school decks. The stat line, sure, she got a decrease from 2 to 1, but that doesn't and people aren't using Voyager for the stats. They're using her for her ability. They're using her to bring out that extra monster that can become a bigger threat than the Voyager herself. In terms of the Witch Doctor was always sort of an underused card that, barely, I think, a few percent of the player base ended up using in those competitive school decks. Sure, it was a nice bulky 3G unit, but I don't think people really prefer the monster package over Witch Doctor and cards like Captain, and other things along those. I think, yeah, Knight of Flowers, Captain, all kind of overpassed Witch Doctor in terms of school decks. So he kind of really is, one of the minor cards used in these school-based decks. So the change to him didn't really show any kind of effect in lowering the popularity. So from there, of course, how do school decks operate, and how can I successfully play against them? Well, there is a major flaw in school decks, as they purposely rely on school alone to really get nasty and get powerful. Usually a lot of school decks nowadays focus more on, coin rather than good stuff for some reason. At least that's what I've seen here and there. People favoring more treasure in their decks rather than the good stuff that keeps kind of the deck reliable and consistent. So the way to kind of put a halt to them is always target the School of Knowledge. As soon as that building goes, a school deck is essentially dead in the water. They're relying off the draw. Um, it might be a little tougher early on. Like, you can't immediately expect them to, start decreasing in power once you destroy the school. You kind of have to push them to use their remaining resources and eventually just kind of overexhaust themselves, being left with no defense and no backup resources from the school draws. Usually with these more coin-based decks now, they can essentially, or these school players will end up sometimes dead drawing a couple of times, only getting cards that will increase their gold count, which would be useful if they had the School of Knowledge to cycle, but if they don't have that school, it ultimately means, a dead card for them, or a dead turn. So that's something to take note of. In terms of the good stuff, though, you kind of have to counter them as, they come, like, I would say, like, normal counters, but I feel like I don't really have a definition or, a set term to just classify as normal counters. It's just kind of as they come along. I mean, you guys have played against various cards before, so I know that's kind of a rude thing to kind of mention about, like, oh, just counter them the normal way. But it always depends on what you're going to see during a game, because you never know. A deck could have a Minotaur, but you can never end up seeing that Minotaur in a game. So, really, you're going to have to handle, as they come, handle them. But with school decks, you might have more of a percentage of dead draws than actual useful units. So that's why they're pretty much lower on this list. They have a really, really big chance of backfiring on you. And, forcing you to go off the draw is always a rough situation to be in. So for that reason, and I think for the others that I mentioned, in this time frame of going over the school deck, that's why I think it's still a valuable deck. But of course, you have to be careful when playing it, because you do have that reliance on school. So if you shift more towards good stuff, you might have more of a chance. But then again, sometimes people like to just overpopulate on school and then get a massive amount of draw into their hands. So for that reason, and again, like I mentioned, the others that are in this time frame, that's why I classify school deck as being my number three meta deck of August and September 2018. Our next deck is composed of two colors you guys are probably very familiar with, of course, a Crusader Warlock deck. However, it is not a good stuff deck per se. The most recent update, of course, hit these two factions pretty hard. Of course, Arbiter's Return being increased to 8 gold to no longer be able to pull out those Arbiter Detonation combinations. Altar now being increased to 3 gold, being put in the Warlock faction, but that's more of a general thing. And Flamestorm being increased to 3 gold as well, to kind of hold off on Tarius file plays, or at least make them more risky to perform. However, because those things were hit, it didn't really affect the deck that we're going to discuss now. Of course, like I said, it did hit the good stuff deck pretty hard. We've seen a decrease in those lately. Of course, they're still here and there, but to a much lesser capacity than what we once saw them in. But a deck that really hasn't decreased in power and is probably still considered a very dangerous deck alongside School is going to be Last Will. These guys haven't really lost their place since the update, and of course I can even mention that they may have gotten a little bit stronger even, now that a couple of things, like, maybe stronger is a rough term to use, but they have definitely seen an uptick in play recently. And like I said, they just haven't really been hit that hard by the most recent changes. Nothing really has affected them too much to decrease their power. And seeing as how they were still being played before the update, at the same kind of level, maybe a little less than the good stuff, this update gave them an opportunity to rise above their good stuff counterpart and really solidify themselves, solidify themselves on their own is probably a better term to use there. let's go ahead and look at the deck itself. What do you guys have to worry about when facing a Last Will deck, and what are some noticeable flaws? Of course, let's start with the strength of the Last Will deck. It is still extremely powerful. Cards like Andrew in general work together so well. Of course, creating Andrew or making Andrew into this monster. Normally going to things like 4-7, 8-11, which is a brutal stat line to counter unless you're carrying things like Mercenaries, Execution, or Murder. If you are, hitting the giant a little bit to bring it down to that murder range, of course, that's still an option too. But along with the giant itself, you guys are dealing with, of course, the Warlock and Crusader. So, of course, Warlock is packing Burns, Blue Firebolt, Flame Storm, and Defective Flame Cannon, just to name a few. Meanwhile, the Crusaders are packing some heal and additional draw, perhaps in the form of a Divine Knowledge, and of course, Arbiter's Return. I think that's draw and heal, respectively. And the good stuff doesn't stop there, with Crusaders also utilizing Kraxus for additional draw. In terms of the Last Will units, of course, you guys aren't really, you shouldn't be unknown to them. Of course, Lumberjack, Salahar Rider, and Banshee, some of the more commonly used Last Will units out there. Sunflower, here and there, you could probably see, you could probably expect him to make an appearance or so. And then, of course, Taria's Files, which everyone loves. Of course, burning that away gets you 2 cards, both having decreased costs from what they originally are. I think, what's the discount? One less. And, of course, like I mentioned, the General. And then you also have Grendel sometimes here and there. But that's also depending on the playstyle, because usually, if you're a person like me, I don't like to give my opponent anything to really benefit off of. So chances are it's dependent on the playstyle whether or not you will see a Grendel thrown up onto the board. But that's again personal playstyle. I think I said again in the span of 3 seconds twice. Anyway, moving on. The rest of the deck, of course, might be filled with some standard good stuff units. Of course, Flux can be in there, Barbarian, Ranger, things that you guys aren't really or shouldn't be surprised about. But and then again, maybe here and there, like I got a Night of Flowers in here. That could always change. Again, people make their decks differently, so not everything's the same. But the borderline factors that remain the same are going to be your Last Will units, and then of course Andrew and Burns and whatnot. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the weaknesses. What do you have to watch out for when playing this deck, or at least how, or maybe a better term, is how do I properly, counter this deck? Well, the first thing you should do is probably hold off on killing Last Will units after Andrew has come out. Now, I think there's now that I'm mentioning this in my head, I think there's probably 2 ways to best describe this. The Last Will units kind of there's a thing, or there's a way that I personally think is a good idea to look at them on the board, and that's kind of pre and post Andrew appearance. Usually when or before Andrew is able to come out, I would say hit those Last Will units hard. Make sure that their Last Will sacrifices cannot be used to benefit Andrew in the slightest. Make sure that those decks are, really pushed back. I know usually the Last Will users like to retreat their units to keep them alive, so that way when the time comes to bring out Andrew, they're still alive and their Last Wills can effectively be used to power up Andrew. But if those Last Will units are destroyed before Andrew comes out, Andrew's going to have a very hard time powering himself up. And of course, that's going to be a severe flaw to the deck. If Andrew stays at 2-5, there goes your powerhouse. It kind of just stays stays the same for many turns potentially. So yeah, definitely push those early Last Will units hard. And if you have Last Will units of your own, again, people like to run Lumberjack, Banshee, Salahar Rider away from Last Will decks. Those cards do help these guys as well. Regardless of, and if any Last Will is used, Andrew will get the power up. So I'm saying if you are running Last Will units going up against a Last Will based deck, try to utilize the Last Will units before Andrew comes out. Charge them up there. Sacrifice them. Try to get some early damage if you can. Draw a cycle. Whatever you can to help you without helping your opponent. Kind of get that out of the way before Andrew comes out. Now, when post Andrew comes out, when Andrew does eventually make his appearance, and if you still have Last Will units, try to keep them away, try to keep them back, don't let them get hit. Of course, they might get burned, But if they do get burned, that means that the burn wasted to power up Andrew and not hurting maybe one of your main targets or your counter to Andrew. So keep that in mind. If you have last will units post Andrew appearance, keep them back. Keep them maybe not protected, but definitely keep them back towards your castle, so that way they don't help your opponent inadvertently. So with that being said, other weaknesses of the Last Will deck, um, I think that's dependent on how they play the game. They can obviously cap out at well, not cap out is that's not the right term. They can easily overexhaust themselves like any deck can. So just make sure that if you are pressing the advantage against your opponent, make sure you're forcing them to use resources that they rather not use. That's always usually helpful. But yeah, I think that's gonna cover it for the Last Will deck. I'm just kind of thinking to myself if there's anything I don't think there is. I mentioned Andrew, the good stuff. Yeah, no, I think I did get everything. So, with that being said, this is why Last Will is number 2, of course, but there is still number 1 to get to. So let's go ahead and find out which deck has taken the number 1 spot for this edition of Meta Monthly. Alright, so here we are. What deck has taken the number 1 spot in this edition of Meta Monthly? It's actually a deck that I'm quite surprised of, but I think that you guys will agree with once I kind of explain myself. So the deck that I feel like has taken the number 1 spot is, of course, Pirate Druid good stuff decks. Now I know that kind of sounds odd. How can Druids be at a top meta spot if the faction is still incomplete? Well, there is an interesting reason behind that. Of course, the deck, like any other deck, of course, it's not gonna have a 100% win rate. But what makes this deck special in this edition of Meta Monthly, like I said, this kind of goes back to what I said about school decks and the Pirate faction in particular. The Pirates did not get hit as much, when comparing to Crusaders or Warlocks. They're still as powerful as they were pre-patch. Cards like Scope, Rat Hovel, Mugging, Salahar Voyager, Southward Captain, they did not receive any change at all, so they still maintain the same power that they once had. But why do Druids work, you might ask? Well, the popular consensus in these good stuff decks is that Fenrir and Scope is the ultimate combination of just a chaotic unit. Putting a Scope on a Fenrir, having it hit from a range, having it hit with a range-based attack, rampaging, running away, and continuing to gain attack is very difficult to really counteract. And if they have stat buffs or continue to keep them alive via things like maybe Spirit Link, Armory, Bestial Rage for that +1/+1, they can keep that Fenrir alive for pretty long. But you might ask, well, Fenrir can't be the only reason that this deck is doing so well, and I tell you to that fact, true. Fenrir isn't the only reason. It's probably the most popular reason, though. Of course, Fenrir and Scope, the most deadly combination currently, I think, for this deck faction, or at least this deck combination, I should say. But the deck isn't without its other threats. Of course, Call for Aid is still a very powerful card, adding 2 Rangers to your hand that cost 5 gold. So, of course, the cheaper Ranger play, and that you have 2 of them. Things like Leanna, of course, people like to throw maybe a little bit of Leanna in their decks. They have the ramp to do it from the Pirates, so that can definitely be an option. Of course, creating a 10 health Spirit Link barrier around your units, definitely tricky. Companions, of course, Centaur, acting as sort of a building removal or soft removal. When you think about it, lunging him across the map and taking out important targets for your opponent. So, yeah, a lot of different factors to contribute to the rise of Druid Pirate decks. I kind of closed out of the deck, I apologize. So, yeah, like I said, a lot of things going on. And, of course, you do have other pirate things I mentioned previously. You got the monster package if you want. You've got a couple of ramp bits here and there, and like I mentioned, Scope, a very, very powerful card, which did not get hit at all like a lot of these pirate cards didn't. So, yeah, definitely a strong deck. In terms of strength, I kind of already pieced out here and there when I was going over other choices why the deck is so popular. The neutral good stuff combined with untouched Druid Pirate potential. Essentially, that's kind of what we're getting at here. Ramp, Scope, Companionship, Fenrir, Call for Aid, Leanna, all pretty big threats when you think about it. And with the Warlock and Crusaders being weakened as they were by the patch, it's allowed them to kind of sneak in and take up this new position of power in the meta. Now, I know that it is, of course, difficult to make a deck like this when you think about it. Call for Aid, Fenrir, both considered legendary cards, so is Leanna. Um, so there's a reason why we don't maybe see too much of it. I still think, though, it's definitely more viable than a Last Will based deck, so or a school deck for that matter as well, if it's number one here. So yeah, a lot of different options to or as to why this deck is so powerful. In terms of weaknesses, of course, it's hard to really pinpoint an exact weakness to this combination of cards. Obviously, I would say a draw definitely hurts them because these guys aren't Crusaders. So anything that isn't Crusaders are going to have a slight issue with draw. I mean, in terms of that, there isn't really much else to go on as a weakness. They pretty much have a lot of different things here and there that can work so well together. And of course, I'm just showing you one variation of the deck. There are other variations that maybe focus more on certain aspects than others. But I just kind of made this as a general idea, and that kind of goes for all decks on this list. So, yeah, that's kind of why I think the Pirate Druids are at a number one spot in this month's meta, at least. Untouched by the patch, and given the power that they already had pre-patch, them not being affected really let them rise to power and prominence. Of course, with things I've already mentioned various times already: Call for Aid, Fenrir Scope, Centaur Companions, Monster Package. You can make a list probably bigger than mine to throw on there, but if you can think of it, they probably have that in there somewhere, except for maybe draw. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I think I've overhyped this too much potentially, but this is why I think the Pirate Druids anyway are probably the best deck to currently use in this month's meta because of how much they bring and how much they can provide to you. With that being said, guys, that's going to do it for this edition of Meta Monthly. If you guys did enjoy this video, please make sure to give it a like, share with a friend, and comment down below your thoughts on this edition of Meta Monthly. Do you agree with me or do you not? Tell me why in the comment section below. While you're down there, if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit that subscribe button to help show your support to the channel and help us grow, all by clicking that subscribe button at no additional cost to you. So, with that being said, that's all from me for now. So until next time, guys, stay gaming.